Our service continues with our Bible study from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to chapter 5, verse 20. Now, the pattern on these Bible studies has been that I've used the first part of the section for the Bible study and then the later part for the sermon, but I'm going to flip that today. So bear with me as I skip past the ending of chapter 4 and head straight into chapter 5. Trust me, we'll get there, but don't worry. We have one of the oddest stories in the gospel where Jesus negotiates with a legion of demons and wastes tons and tons of precious bacon. So let's look at chapter 5, verse 1 to 20. And that's right, we're going to do the whole rest of it in one fell swoop, as this section is almost always considered to be one complete unit. It's one story, not necessarily broken apart. You kind of need to hear all of it to even begin to dig into the beginning of it. So let's hear this, chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tomb with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his lungs, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged Jesus earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine. Let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with Jesus. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone who was amazed. This is the longest and most detailed of Mark's exorcism accounts. I got so wrapped up in it that I didn't even realize I had finished reading it and was going into my commentary there. So I apologize for that, but it's a long single story, the longest one of its kind in Mark. And we must not lose sight of the overall message, which is part of the reason why it's important to read it all together, is that we need to see, shown throughout it, is the amazing power of Jesus, what he is capable of doing, what others can see in him, even though this is before the crucifixion, before the resurrection. These demons, this legion, sees him for who he is. His authority extends over the realm of unclean, hostile spirits, and he brings healing to troubled people. That is always a message that we need to hear, because we can lose sight of that. We can lose sight of what God is doing in a world that's going on around us. But Jesus does have that power and does come to us again and again, trying to heal us in the ways that God can. So once again, we have only the demons and unclean spirits seeing Jesus for who he truly is. As the first words of this section, the vocalized words, come from the unclean spirit who calls Jesus Son of the Most High God. Again, this is part of what we call the Messianic secret, where according to tradition, Jesus wasn't as clear about his identity with everyone as we might expect or we might like, but those who know in Mark, those with this seemingly hidden knowledge, they let the cat out of the bag regularly, even though Jesus might try to tell them to keep it down. And that happened once again in this passage, that someone knew more than they should have. And while we might think Jesus is letting this unclean spirit off easy by sending those spirits into the water, those depths of the sea, that primeval abyss, that was considered to be their actual home in those days. What we would regularly call hell, but hell as we know it now was not as well put together, formulated, or discussed as it is today. And that's a whole Bible study in and of itself. So we can get lost in the details of all of that, but again, the important part, Jesus' authority prevails. They can't go until he tells them to go, and when he tells them to go, they go immediately. Jesus is truly in charge, acts with mercy, and sends people where he wills. But the more we dig into this section, the more interesting it becomes. They're in Gentile lands here. Where exactly is muddled by the three gospel accounts, because they don't say it the same way. But here we find out kind of towards the end as the former possessed man shares that he's in the Decapolis. But keep in mind, Gentile means, well, they are unclean. It doesn't mean unclean, they are unclean, which is a person that's outside of those that belong. And then add to it everything unkosher you could possibly find. And it's right here in this passage. The spirits are unclean. They're by the tombs where the dead, we know touching the dead is a kind of a no-no. It's unkosher. You become unclean. And then pigs. Don't forget about those non-kosher pigs. Now, there could be a lot to be said about how far Jesus will go to be with those on the margins. Think about where Jesus is right now and where he should be if he was following where we say the Messiah should have gone in those times. But he goes to everybody. He goes to the outcasts, those that are on the margins, those who are outside of those who belong. But the text doesn't necessarily seem to go there, even though it's heavily in our face. What it really seems to want to tell us is that even when Jesus is not quote-unquote on home court, he's still very much in charge. So no matter where you put him, no matter where you find yourself, Jesus has the power to help you where you are. Now about that legion, it's borrowed from a Latin phrase and refers to an army unit of 4,000 to 6,000 persons. So on his own, Jesus defeats an army, again, powerful. He routs them into the sea. Now, where some might see an error in the text because there's a shift from singular to plural in describing this possessed individual, it most likely is setting up the drama of the story, starting with an unclean spirit. Do not torment me, my name is Legion. And shifting to we are many, and they begged him. It makes it that much more scary. He asks him his name, and then suddenly we know it's not just two people, there's more. It's a story where you walk up to an individual in an alley, not as scary, but then suddenly a bunch of people come around the corner and you're not alone. You can almost imagine Peter spinning this tale around a campfire, because remember, these are Peter's kind of preaching notes that Mark is making use of, at least we think. And we wonder now, as we're reading this story, how will Jesus survive? He's now surrounded by an army. Will he make it out of this dastardly attack? Find out next week on Peter's prescient adventures. It could have been that way. We forget about that a lot of times when we're reading, specifically in the Old Testament, that is purely an oral tradition, about how many of those stories were told, not necessarily around a campfire, but in a group, and maintaining that attention, drawing people in, it's important. And here we have Peter and Mark being that great storyteller. And we only find out about the number of people present in this possessed individual because Jesus asked that all-important personal question, "What is your name?" In those days, to know the name of someone is to discover their inner character and exercise power over them. You've heard it in so many legends and stories, but that's how they believed it in that time. Their name had power. Jesus immediately understands their nature and understands that they have to go and go quickly. Now, here comes maybe my favorite connection in the text. For we all feel sorry for the man possessed. We all know he needs to get better, but the text asks the question, how different is that one possessed man from the unruly mob that comes after, angry about the lost pigs and demanding that Jesus leave, even though he just healed and cured somebody? Now, I feel for those pig farmers. I really do. In that one moment of grace, their lives were turned upside down. And if it was all of their pigs, they lost potentially everything. I get that. But to place the life of those pigs over the life of the man who was resigned to live in the tombs, being constantly tormented, property over people's lives, this text clearly chooses a side. Jesus clearly chooses a side. And the actions of the mob, they are much more easy to see ourselves in than perhaps the possessed man. Because what does it know to be, how many of us know what it's like to be possessed by a legion? But we've been moved by the shouts and anger of a crowd. In verse 6, when he saw Jesus from a distance, this possessed man ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." And in verse 17, the crowd shows up. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. They immediately ask him to leave, both of them, both of these groups, you could say. And then in verse 10, the possessed man does not want to be parted from his demons. He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And in verse 16, we find what drew the crowd out. And in honesty, it wasn't about the man that had lived in the tomb that they had ignored for so long, because you don't ask a miracle worker to leave. But a property damager, on the other hand, those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. That's what drew them out. They didn't want to be separated from those pigs, from that property, and they were unhappy that he had done so. This text is screaming out that we are becoming attached to the things that are quote unquote ours and make us act in ways that don't at all align with the kingdom of God. A kingdom built on reckless love and endlessly seeking the betterment of our neighbor. That's Christianity in a nutshell. We just don't always want to follow those rules. And to wrap this up, we need to look closely at the sending of the former demoniac, who is the first example of a Gentile mission in Mark. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged Jesus that he might be with him, but Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." This man went from begging to be left alone to begging to go with Jesus. But his mission, his new mission, is an important one, because it's one that greatly affects us. Many people are members of the church that they are because their friends or family invited them to that church. Many people can't hear good advice, even from experts, until their friends and family share or are affected by that particular issue, that piece of advice that they couldn't hear before. They can a lot of times hear it from those closest to them. This is a mission from Jesus that's given to this formerly possessed man that we need to take seriously. Through the relationships and connections that we've already made, we can truly make a difference in the lives of those we love most. It might not always work, and we might beg Jesus to take us with him, to be sent somewhere else, to go with him to lands unknown. But so many times our mission is closer to home, and we need to take that call seriously. Now, our sermon's going to backtrack to that part that we missed for today, and we'll pick up on the next section next week. Thanks for joining us for this Bible study.